Call the meeting to order. We'll get underway. We've still got a few coming in, I'm sure, but, well, the main folks are here, let me put it that way. And I want to welcome Senator Boisvenu to our table today. We welcome people of all political persuasions to come to our meetings. So this is the Open Caucus. I'm Art Eggleton, a senator from Toronto, and my co-chair beside me is Senator Claudette Tardif from Alberta. Through this Open Caucus initiative, we are opening our doors to Canadians, to parliamentarians, and to the media. We want to learn about and discuss issues of national importance. This effort is hosted by the Senate Liberal Caucus, but it's intended to be nonpartisan, and we welcome and encourage a variety of opinions during these discussions. Well, our subject this morning, as you know, is mental health in prisons. Federal prisons now house some of the largest concentrations of people with mental health conditions in the country. We estimate that over a third of inmates in our Canadian prisons, both federal and provincial, have some sort of mental health conditions. Moreover, last January, it was found that more than 25% of inmates are Aboriginal, and many of them also suffer from mental illness. And of course, the issues of solitary confinement, the use of those kind of facilities has become a very controversial issue. Factors such as deficits in literacy, education, housing, employment, social support networks, income, and social status explain in part why Canadian prisoners have health problems. In some, mental health is a serious issue for Canadians, for the Canadian incarcerated population. Now, just on a logistics basis, I want to point out that we do have coffee, tea available at the back of the room for anybody who wants it, and translation is available. If you have one of the regular sets that's attached to where you're sitting, it'll be channel 1 for English and channel 2 for French, but if you have a mobile translation unit, the floor, whatever language, is 12, English is 13, French, Francais, 14. Now, in addition to the senators who are here, we do welcome participation from the audience. We have a nice big audience today, obviously people that are very concerned about this issue. So if you would like to say something, we will work you in to the agenda. There are 2 microphones, as you can see, number 7 and number 30. And anybody from the audience that wants to speak can do so for up to 3 minutes. It would be either speaking or asking a question. Your choice, okay? So if you want to do that, I just need to get your name down on paper. And there are 2 guys over here from my staff, Mike and Lexi, and you give them the information. They'll come around and check and see who wants to participate, and we'll work you in. So, with that, my co-chair, Claudette Tardif.
Merci. Bonjour. Bon matin.
Good morning. I'm happy to welcome you here at this Open Caucus. I thank speakers to have accepted our invitation this morning, and I welcome you all here in the room, here in great number. Thank you for being there. As Senator Eggleton said, mental health problems affect the detainees in federal prisons. We estimate that over a third of inmates in our Canadian prisons have some sort of mental health conditions. A recent internal study of the Department of Public Safety mentioned that the limited services and programs in the Canadian justice system focused on the mentally ill people pose obstacles to helping reduce the overrepresentation of this group as offenders. Mentally ill inmates is a subject of public interest, national public interest. We welcome 5 speakers today, and they come from different backgrounds, and they graciously accepted our invitation. So without any further delay, We will now hear the presentation of our first speaker, Dr. Gary Chaimowitz. Is professor and forensic division head in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioural Neurosciences at McMaster University in Hamilton, Canada. He's head of service forensic psychiatry. He has an MBA from the University of Toronto and is a certified physician executive from the American College of Physician Executives. He's chair of the Psychiatry section of the Ontario Medical Association and past president of the Ontario Psychiatric Association of Ontario. He chairs the Forensic Psychiatry Specialty Committee of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons and has Forensic Psychiatry Founder status. He's co-chair of the Ontario Forensic Directors Group and also member of the Ontario Nunavut Review Board and vice chair of the Consent and Capacity Board. As you can see, we're lucky to have such a highly skilled speaker. Dr. Chaimowitz, you have the floor.
Honourable Senators, Members of Parliament, members of the public, thank you very much for this invitation to address you on the critical issue of mental health in prisons. I am going to speak to you as a clinician working in and around this area, but I'm going to tell you I immigrated to Canada 3 decades ago from South Africa. I love this country and I love the values that we espouse. However, the very first time I visited the segregation area of one of our detention centers, I was horrified at the scene of psychotic men wailing, screaming, banging, undressed, some wallowing in their personal excrement in hard, dank rooms. In fact, rooms the size of the bed that I slept in the hotel last night. And yet these conditions are treatable. There's magic in psychiatry. We can actually treat psychosis. It is one of those magical things. And I wish I could say that the situation is improved, but men and women still continue to languish in unbelievably deplorable conditions, close to, but out of sight and out of the minds of usually caring Canadians. What I've described as the sharp end of a shameful way that Canadian citizens with mental illness in our correctional system are treated. This is despite the hardworking women and men, correctional officers, nurses, psychologists, administrators, psychiatrists try and do with inadequate resources in an inadequate situation. I'm not going to overwhelm you with statistics. Most of us have taken our statistics from Mr. Sapers. Most of us are actually quite familiar with the literature. But I want to tell you that our federal prisons and our provincial prisons house one of the largest concentrations of people with psychiatric illness, many of them held for long periods in segregation. Canada, a leader in so many areas, has fallen behind in the treatment of mental illness in correctional settings. We do have amazing programs, but the system is flawed. I believe that all Canadians have a right to equitable, appropriate healthcare, regardless of where they live or the situation they are in. Canadians must consider how best to resolve those and how to ensure that people with mental illness, addictions, trauma histories, people at risk of increased poverty, increased homelessness, who end up in the criminal justice system, have an opportunity for increased success when they return to the community. It's underfunded, it's under-resourced, it's unseen and inadequately supported. Advocacy in education is critical. Primary prevention, diversion programs, improved access to psychiatric care for all Canadians is essential. Untreated mental illness in the community leads to increased numbers of people with untreated mental illness in correctional settings. Our jails are brutal places, and they are de facto become the institution of last resort for people with mental illness. I believe that if our legislators, our regulators, and all Canadians truly knows what happens behind bars, they will be galvanized to do something to make sure that we have equitable access to those people with mental illness in correctional settings. The Mental Health Commission of Canada has articulated a strategy to address some of these failures. Why not open avenues for communication and bring all of our jurisdictions together in a pan-Canadian renegotiation of a health accord where there are requirements to ensure that there is care, that we reduce segregation, and that we make sure that the people Canadians in correctional settings get the care that they deserve. We as a country can lead by example. We can improve access to appropriate care. We can reduce untreated psychiatric illness. We can continue to fund diversion programs. We can enhance first responders' abilities to deal with people with mental illness. We can rebuild our facilities with a rehabilitation focus. They are not structured in a way that enhances rehabilitation. We can and we must reduce segregation. In psychiatry, in psychiatric hospitals in this country, even though I was one of the people who said we can't do it, we have reduced seclusion, the equivalent of segregation, in psychiatric facilities beyond belief. It can be done in corrections. We must improve follow-up. We must bring our partners together. I believe we are a caring society and we can do this. Many people have worked hard to assist with the management of mental illness. We need help to do this. This problem is too complex, too complicated, too important to be left to the individuals. We need the federal government to lead this process by bringing partners together and actually doing something about this shameful situation. It is the right thing to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chaimowitz. And now I'll turn to next panelist, who is Lee Chapelle. He is a former inmate who has served 21 years in the federal correctional system. He served in various prisons as an inmate committee chairman, an inmate elected position, lobbying for prisoner human rights. Following his release from prison and his successful completion of his sentence in 2010, Mr. Chapelle founded the Canadian Prison Consulting Incorporated, an advocacy and reform-based organization. Mr. Chapelle has authored a book on Canadian corrections, Hard Time in Canada, One Man's Journey Inside and Out, believing Canadians deserve to better understand what's really happening inside the walls of our prison system. Mr. Chapelle.
Thank you, sir. It's an honor and a privilege to be here today and to speak in the Senate, certainly. I'm going to take the road less traveled. I seem to have done that most of my life, and I think share a few anecdotes, personal experiences that I believe relevant here today. I began advocacy work from inside prisons as an elected representative, as Senator Eglinton shared, working with inmate populations and as a peer counselor. In 2001, prior to beginning this work, 15 years roughly into my sentence, I faced a critical moment where I felt like I was losing my sanity. And it was the most terrifying thing that I'd ever faced. You know, we see in movies, we see depicted in the media, we talk of violence and a variety of things that are horrible that occur in prisons, but the fear of losing your mind, certainly while you're locked away, is one that I can relate to. I bring this up because I was fortunate. This was in 2001, and I had failed repeatedly leading up until this point. My sentence was an aggregate sentence, meaning that I had been released, failed, been returned to prison time and time again. I continued to try. I was battling addictions. I can say that our system was certainly, we don't have to look that far back to see when it was better. The 80s and 90s, you know, the introduction of the CCRAs, the CCRRs, the Charter of Rights, there was a real determined effort from the federal government towards rehabilitation, towards community corrections, towards root causes and working with people, treating inmates with dignity, understanding the long view that 95%, the majority of inmates, are released back to our communities. I feel I benefited from this. A lot of good people took time and worked with me. It left imprints. It didn't happen magically. Nonetheless, I continued to work towards, you know, I can say anybody who's in a prison right now certainly doesn't feel like they've accomplished what they set out to do. And it's a time when you're very vulnerable and you're very open to change. And so I think if the tools are there, certainly we could make much better use of the Canadian citizens' money, taxpayer money that goes into our system with a long view approach. So in 2001, again, as a guy who had failed time and time again, never mind second chance, I think it had been half a dozen chances at that point, when I was battling my mental health issues, I was able to obtain help, gratefully so. There was an institutional psychologist that I was able to access, and it was the beginning of a long road of change. I began taking university courses. I essentially cut subculture from my life. I realized that guilty knowledge and being involved in what I had been involved with was a big part of the anxiety that I experienced and was feeling. And I was able to begin turning the corner. I can say today, I believe that help would not be available if it were now as opposed to then. I work with many people today. I work with clients who are facing incarceration, most of them for the very first time. I work with their families. I do everything in my power to prepare them for what is coming. I often find that going through a bail process is a catalyst in its own right for people doing self-inventory, realizing that they're not where they want to be in life, and it's a great opportunity to begin working proactively towards not just making it through prison, but never returning to it. And that is one of the goals that I certainly promote with the people I work with. And the cornerstones of the work I do are based upon accountability, ownership, insight, remorse, and are prefaced by acceptance and forgiveness. I think often we find in our prisons many people who, before they were adults, were victimized themselves and are troubled. So anyhow, my message today is certainly not one of poor inmate. I believe ownership and accountability has to exist from the people who do this, but I also believe if I demand that of the people I work with, and if the system, and as Canadians we demand that from our neighbors and our communities, I think we're not asking too much to ask that of our system. Basic human rights, healthcare, certainly at the top of the list, and we're failing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chapelle, for sharing with us your personal journey and your very thoughtful reflections. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Nous allons maintenant attendre.
We will now hear Mrs. Catherine Latimer. Mrs. Latimer has been the Executive Director of the John Howard Society since April 2011. Prior to accepting the position with the John Howard Society of Canada, she was a Director General, Youth Justice and Strategic Initiatives and Law Reform with the Department of Justice Canada. Ms. Latimer has been a key advisor to the most senior members of the civil service, ministers of the cabinet on many issues and initiative matters. She teaches criminal law, juvenile justice, policy and law reform at Carleton University and at the University of Ottawa. She is a Broadbent Fellow and is currently President of the National Association active in criminal justice. She has a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Waterloo, a law degree from Queen's University, and a Master of Philosophy and Criminology from Cambridge University. Welcome.
particularly when the Senate and so many community members are interested in tackling this current crisis that we're facing about mental health and prisons. Prisons essentially are not designed to accommodate those who are battling mental illnesses. CSC does have a good mental health strategy, but it is not being implemented in a way that actually achieves the results that so many of us would like to see. I could go on at length, but constrained as I am by my 7 minutes, there are really sort of 4 areas that I would like to focus on. One is reducing the numbers of mentally ill in prisons. 2 is ensuring prisons do not actually worsen people's mental health. 3 is looking at the continuity of care, ensuring that when people are moving from institution to institution or moving from the institutions back into the communities, that there is a plan to continue to address their mental health issues. And fourthly, to really look at the role of parliamentarians, since we have the year of the senators, about what effectively can be done about these problems. So there is a lot of speculation about what has led to record numbers of people battling mental health issues finding their way into our prisons. A lot of it may have to do with the deinstitutionalization that happened in the 70s for mental health facilities, and really the prisons being the default position or the default institution that can do little but accept people who have been convicted of crimes, who have mental health issues. And I think we need to really look at whether or not there are adequate community-based treatment resources in an effort to try and keep people out of the prison justice system. I think we also need to look at updated criminal regimes when we're looking at people with mental health. The definition of the defense is very antiquated based on the McNaughton rules, which emerged in the 1830s, and thankfully our knowledge of mental health and psychiatry and neuroscience have progressed significantly since then, and taking another look at these issues I think would be very significant. We also see the not criminally responsible regime making it uninviting for people to raise the defense of their mental illnesses when they're coming into the criminal justice system. I think we need to look at that as well. Also important is looking at alternatives to the criminal justice system for those who have mental health issues. And I would just raise as very briefly that there is a very good example of that in Ottawa, which have looked at providing housing to those that are hardest to serve, hardest to house, and that includes people with existing mental health conditions, active addiction issues, homelessness, record of involvement in the criminal justice system. And I'm sure that those who are, this is a facility that's operated by the John Howard Society and their health partners here in Ottawa, and I'm sure they would welcome you coming to see how successful that model is in keeping people from drifting in and out of the prison system who are experiencing mental health challenges. I think we also need to be able to transfer out of the prison to treatment centers those who are looking at the most serious mental health issues. Key also is ensuring that those who are in the prison system, that their mental health issues are not made worse. And the definition of mental health is very flexible, and certainly anybody going into the prison system will experience depression and anxiety. I experience depression and anxiety when I go into the prison systems, and I'm only there for a couple hours at a time. So people who are living there will initially experience this very profoundly. We need to ensure that the treatment of those who are experiencing mental health issues is adequate. And we really need to look at whether or not the services that are provided to prisoners are comparable to those that are being provided to those on the outside. You see a lot of problems. I don't know whether Howard is going to pick this up, but the staff positions being under targeted, so that people who don't necessarily meet the qualifications to provide the psychiatric and psychological assistance to prisoners, they don't necessarily have the qualifications for those positions but are providing the services anyway, which really raises some significant problems. Another issue that has been raised in international human rights legislation and others, human rights bodies, is who should have authority over the health of prisoners. Should it be the correctional authorities, or should it be the civilian mental health carriers or providers? And that would make, I think, a significant difference if we took a look at ensuring that the civilian, those that provide health care for everyone are also responsible for providing health care for the prisoners. From our perspective, what is really contributing to a worsening of mental health conditions is the abusive use of segregation and solitary confinement. I think all of us were delighted to see the mandate letters from the Prime Minister to the Minister of Justice and hopefully to Public Safety, which really looked at implementing the recommendations coming out of the Ashley Smith report, and also not putting people with existing mental health conditions into segregation. I would encourage people to move quickly on implementing those recommendations, because people continue to suffer by being subjected to long-term segregation, and it would be good to stop that now that it's been recognized as a significant problem. There should also be a broader recognition of the issues affecting the mental health of prisoners. So brain injury, earlier exposure to trauma. I noticed that the mandate letter to the Minister of Public Safety includes a national strategy on PTSD. And I would really encourage that prisoners be included, not just the correctional officers who also often suffer from PTSD by having been exposed to some of the violence and some of the issues that they've borne witness to in the prisons, but also the prisoners who live there and are also exposed to that kind of trauma. Third point, continuity of care. Movement of people who are suffering from mental health issues, it's very important that the regime of support that is in place continue. We often see that people who are in prisons and are moving to the communities leave prisons with 2 weeks' supply of medications. And if those are psychotropic medications, it doesn't give a lot of time to connect with the experts and the specialists in the community who will continue on with this very necessary medication. So I think we need to really focus on the continuity of care, and that also includes continuity of care between federal institutions. I have found that prisoners who are moving from an institution in one place or one jurisdiction to another will suddenly be faced with a completely different medical regime. So they may have been completely stabilized on a regime in one jurisdiction, and then they move to another prison and they implement something quite different, which contributes to the destabilizing of the prisoner as they're coming into their new environment, and is not really consistent with what psychiatrists would say is an effective way of managing mental health issues. And this is particularly true from prisoners who are moving from provincial institutions to federal institutions, or from youth institutions into adult institutions. Many of the real problems you will find in people with mental health issues are first identified or not identified in the remand centers in our country. And I think the good doctor mentioned how shocking it is to go into some of those provincial institutions and see the way that people are being treated. Some of the people who move into the federal institutions have spent years in administrative segregation in the provincial institutions. We have a client right now who's been diagnosed as schizophrenic and is moving into his third year in administrative segregation in the Ottawa Carleton Detention Centre, which is far too long, and this person will inevitably be transferred into the federal institution without necessarily there being a recognition of what he has undergone in the provincial institution before he gets into the federal institution. So the continuity of care is also, I think, extremely important. The role of Parliament and parliamentarians is broad and potentially extremely important for shining a light into a very dark area of prison practice which doesn't get enough attention. And it is important, if we're going to mobilize changes, that people understand what the problems are in the federal institutions and in the provincial institutions. So a key area is legislative reform and reviews, particularly if they're broad spectrum reviews, which involve invite insights from more than one department or more than one discipline. This is something that is not always easy to achieve. But keeping an eye on how effective the legislative regimes are and what reforms are necessary would be extremely important in terms of addressing some of these problems. Also, monitoring the effectiveness of programs and existing policies within the federal institutions would be extremely beneficial. And last but not least is the very important provision in the CCRA, which is Section 72, which really provides open access for parliamentarians to come in to the federal institutions. And we would very much encourage senators and parliamentarians to drop in, visit the health care provision, talk to some of the prisoners who are in need of mental health care or getting mental health care, talk to the mental health care providers, and really get a sense of what's going on in the prisons in those areas. I think this would be extremely important in terms of coming up with effective solutions. And I know that the John Howard Society, I'm sure that I'm looking at my friend Kim Pate from the EFRI, would be more than happy to help facilitate any kind of visits to the prisons under Section 72. I thank you very much, and I look forward to working with all of you, community partners and parliamentarians, in terms of addressing these very chronic and serious issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the John Howard Society, together with the Elizabeth Fry Society, who are here today as well, for all the work you've done over decades to help in this system. Howard Sapers is our next panelist. He was appointed the Correctional Investigator of Canada in 2004. Previously, he had been Executive Director of the John Howard Society of Alberta. He's also been an elected member of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta, Director of the National Crime Prevention Center Investment Fund, and Vice Chairperson, Prairie Region of the Parole Board of Canada. Currently, Mr. Sapers serves as a North American Region member of the International Ombudsman Institute Board of Directors and a member of the Board of Directors for the Forum of Canadian Ombudsmen. Mr. Sapers represents the community of small federal departments and agencies on the Government of Canada, Small Department Audit Committee, and is the chairman of the Department of National Defence Canadian Forces Ombudsman Advisory Committee. He's also an adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University School of Criminology. Welcome, Mr. Sapers.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Senators, for asking me to participate and for asking for to hear from the Office of the Correctional Investigator to join this very distinguished panel. Thank you as well, members of the public, for attending. And I'm always impressed by just how much interest this is, and I think, Senators, you've really tapped into a very important set of issues. The challenge I have is, I've never said anything really in under 7 minutes, and I'm going to do my best. The good news there is that there's already been some excellent information shared, and so I was actually been editing my notes. I'm down to just 2 or 3 pre-printed words. I'll try to fill it out. I'll fill it out from there. It is, the task I think I have is to add a little bit of value based on the research and the investigative work of my office. So I'll provide some numbers and our perspective on the prevalence of mental health issues, which includes mental illness as well as a variety of other mental health challenges amongst the federally sentenced offenders. And I'll talk about these challenges as well from the standpoint of what the system faces in trying to meet them, and I'll end with some possible directions for reform. Correctional Service of Canada is well aware of their population demographics. Their own research confirms that federal offenders, for example, are prescribed psychotropic medications at a rate that is 4 times higher than the Canadian population. About a third of federally sentenced men and women inside penitentiaries are on a psychotropic med, compared to about 8% in the communities that surround those penitentiaries. Considerably more federally sentenced women than men had an active psychotropic medication prescription during the last fiscal year. It was actually almost half of federally sentenced women. Last year was about 46%. Previous sampling of incoming male offenders indicate the following prevalence rates. For mood disorders, about 17%, alcohol or substance misuse disorders, about 50%, anxiety disorder, just under 30%, borderline personality, 16%, and antisocial personality disorder, about 41%, a very vulnerable and compromised population. Compared to the general population, addiction and mental illness are more common amongst the incarcerated, though there are few studies that have conclusively established prevalence rates. That said, many of the known indicators point to higher than average linkages between mental health and substance abuse disorders, and this comorbidity is perhaps one of the biggest challenges that we face. Upon admission, 80% of male offenders have a substance abuse issue. Over half reported that alcohol or drug use was a factor in the commission of their index offense, or that offense that led them into penitentiary. Over 90% of offenders diagnosed with one form of a mental disorder concurrently suffer from at least one other. Correctional outcomes for offenders with concurrent disorders are generally poorer than those with substance abuse or mental disorders alone. Substance abuse combined with mental health disorders is a major contributor to poorer outcomes. On comparison, offenders with these concurrent disorders had the highest risk and needs ratings amongst all sentenced offenders. They had more extensive criminal histories. They're more likely to incur both serious and minor institutional charges, and these have tremendous implications for what happens to them while they're incarcerated and how quickly they can make their way into the community. They had higher rates of admission to segregation. They were more likely to reoffend upon release. The takeaway point here is that correctional outcomes are considerably poorer for mentally disordered offenders. This group of individuals is more likely to be incarcerated in higher security facilities, less likely to be granted parole, serve more of their sentence behind bars, and are more likely to incur major and minor charges. This leads to higher use of segregation, and more about that in a minute. Now, these prevalence rates, though they're already comparatively high from what we know, we believe are likely underestimated. Mental illness is typically underreported in the prison environment due to stigma, fear, lack of assessment or diagnosis. We know, for example, that the data that I've already shared with you does not include a significant range of mental disorders, as federal corrections has limited capacity to systematically screen, assess, or diagnose cognitive ability, attention deficit disorders, fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, and other neurological dysfunctions upon admission to a federal pen. For example, depending on the sample size, estimates of FASD prevalence amongst the federally sentenced population vary significantly, with numbers ranging from about 10% to about 24%. A recent sample of newly admitted male offenders suggests a prevalence rate that is 10 times higher inside than in the general population outside. As a spectrum disorder, FASD includes a broad band of factors and indicators that are also fairly common amongst correctional populations. For example, poor educational attainment, poor employment history, lower than average IQ, poor impulse control, impaired executive functioning, and childhood diagnosis of ADD or ADHD. Now, in a correctional setting, think about what that might mean. Such high prevalence rates come with significant challenges: high rates of self-harming and suicidal behaviors, involvement and use of force incidents, segregation, physical restraints, involuntary treatment, and certifications under mental health legislation. In fact, it is our conclusion that some of these significantly mentally disordered offenders simply do not belong, nor can they be safely or humanely managed in a federal correctional facility. Last year, mental health issues or concerns were identified in over 37% of all planned use of force interventions. Segregation is still widely used to manage self-injuring, mentally disordered, and suicidal offenders. Inmates with a segregation history are more likely to have behavioral, mental health, and/or cognitive issues requiring health-focused interventions. I have previously reported that in general, more than 2/3 of the inmate population in the Correctional Services of Canada's 5 regional treatment hospitals, certified hospitals, have also been in segregation. For women inmates, the rate is 79%, and it's 73% for Indigenous inmates. As my office's recent review of prison suicides documented, segregation was found to be an independent factor that elevated the risk of inmate suicide. In fact, 14 of 30 prison suicides between 2011 and 14 took place inside a segregation cell. Nearly all of these inmates had known mental health issues. 5 of the 14 inmates who took their life in segregation had been held in that situation for more than 120 days. Prisons are not hospitals, and the conditions that prevail there are far from therapeutic or rehabilitative. Incarcerating persons with mental health problems in conditions and environments that are poorly suited to meet their needs promotes neither public safety nor rehabilitative objectives. Simply put, there's not enough capacity, resources, or professionals to meet the increased demands being placed on a system never intended to cope with such a profoundly ill population. In terms of directions for reform, let me leave you with 5 key areas my office has identified. Number 1, prohibit long-term segregation of mentally disordered offenders. 2, commit to move toward a restraint-free environment in federal corrections. 3, appoint independent patient advocates at each of the 5 regional treatment centers. Number 4, provide for 24/7 on-site nursing services at all maximum, medium, and multi-level penitentiaries. And 5, develop alternative service delivery and treatment options other than incarceration for significantly mentally ill, federally sentenced offenders. Thank you again, Senators, for the invitation to be here today and for your interest in our work, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sapers, for your very thorough presentation and for all the work that you do. C'est mon plaisir de présenter notre...
It is my pleasure to introduce our final panelist, Mann-Rempel, who was admitted to the bar in 1996 in Ontario. Michelle Mann-Rempel has a master's in law at Queen's University for Aboriginal peoples. In the criminal justice system in May 2012, she currently practices Aboriginal law and is duty counsel for legal advice clinics at the Ottawa Friendship Centre, or rather Odawa Friendship Centre, and the Wabano Aboriginal Health Centre. She is a part-time professor of Aboriginal criminal justice at both the University of Ottawa and Carleton. She also serves as a member of the Office of the Auditor General of Canada's Expert Advisory Committee on Aboriginal Corrections. Michelle Rempel is a Gladue educator, having delivered Gladue corrections training countrywide for numerous clients, including Correctional Services Canada. Welcome, Ms. Rempel.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much to the senators for the invitation to speak today. I will be offering my comments from the perspective of a lawyer who has practiced Aboriginal law and specialized in Aboriginal criminal justice for over 20 years now. So there are many mental health issues that Aboriginal offenders may experience and which can be said to have unique Aboriginal specific or sui generis root causes, including substance abuse, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and depression and anxiety, to name but a few. So for Aboriginal offenders, the unique intergenerational effects of colonization and attempts at forced assimilation are risk factors for the development of mental health problems. So today I plan to briefly canvass Gladue principles and their interaction with Aboriginal mental health in federal corrections, including a specific example of their application in the context of Indian Residential Schools Survivor Syndrome. Indeed, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report of 2015 recognized the impact of Indian Residential School Survivor Syndrome on the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in custody and called upon the federal government to act on this. So what are Gladue principles? Gladue principles arise from subsection 718.2e of the Criminal Code, which provides that a court imposing sentence shall take into consideration all available sanctions other than imprisonment, with particular attention to the circumstances of Aboriginal offenders. So this sounds good, but what does it actually mean in practice? In the R versus Gladue decision, which has led to the sort of more colloquial term that we use, Gladue principles, the Supreme Court of Canada concluded that that subsection of the Criminal Code is intended to reduce the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in federal corrections. It is also meant to facilitate more rehabilitative or restorative approaches when dealing with Aboriginal offenders. In fashioning a fit and proportionate sentence, judges must consider the unique systemic and background factors of Aboriginal offenders. Some of these systemic and background factors that contribute to Aboriginal overrepresentation include poor social and economic conditions, substance abuse, community fragmentation, systemic and direct discrimination, and of course the legacy of dislocation, including the effects of Indian residential schools and the 60s scoop. Judges must also consider sanctions that are culturally appropriate for Aboriginal offenders, given that Aboriginal offenders are less likely to be rehabilitated by incarceration, since it is often culturally inappropriate. Correspondingly, Correctional Services Canada law and policies commit to the implementation of Gladue principles in federal corrections, in both the Corrections and Conditional Release Act and in numerous commissioners' directives. So how do we understand the mental health issues of Aboriginal offenders in corrections through a Gladue lens? Let's take Indian residential school survivor syndrome as an example. We know that survivors of Indian residential schools are prevalent in the criminal justice and correctional systems, and that the syndrome contributes to Aboriginal overrepresentation in corrections. As everyone likely knows, the Crown established residential schools to assimilate Aboriginal people between the 1830s and the 1990s. The schools were intended to sever the culture between generations and the connections between parent and child, which sustain family and community. We also now know that they were rampant with physical, mental, emotional, and sexual abuse. The intergenerational impacts of residential schools are considered to be threefold. The traumas experienced at the school affect the individual, the family, and also the community. Intergenerational and historical trauma arising from these schools are now recognized as well. So Indian residential school survivor syndrome has been recognized as a unique, culturally specific type of post-traumatic stress disorder. Healing of this disorder has important long-term implications for the individual, the Aboriginal community, and Canadian society at large. Whenever the liberty interests of an Aboriginal offender are at stake in the correctional system, their unique systemic and background factors must be taken into account, including a history of Indian residential schools or its intergenerational effects. Thus, a history of residential schools may be seen to be mitigating and understanding an individual offender's behavior. So let's take a fairly simple example, which again, with the 7-minute limitation, is going to be a bit of an abbreviation, but let's take, for example, a disciplinary decision within a correctional institution. A fairly straightforward example of an Aboriginal offender who has been moderately acting out within the institution, being verbally abusive to correctional officers, perhaps refusing to go back into their cell. The correctional officer writing up the assessment decision for this individual must show that they have taken the impacts of residential schools into account in rendering a disciplinary decision. Actively taking into account the impacts of Indian residential school survivor syndrome on the offender's mental health and overall well-being contextualizes the behavior, but also provides an important bridge to a culturally relevant restorative approach as mandated by GLADU. The offender in this situation might be on the receiving end of ramped up elder involvement or other culturally appropriate supports to mitigate risk, rather than the implementation of standard disciplinary measures. We know that disciplinary records have a negative impact on parole grant rates, and that Aboriginal offenders are already released later in their sentences than non-Aboriginal offenders. By avoiding the disciplinary record and implementing culturally appropriate rehabilitation, we are cumulatively contributing to reducing the overrepresentation of Aboriginal offenders in corrections, which is the ultimate goal of GLADU. Correctional Services Canada has adopted and integrated the GLADU approach into its laws and policies and has started implementation. These are promising first steps. Dedicated and thorough implementation of this approach would require further CSC staff training and particularly case management accountabilities, enhanced support of culturally relevant programming and initiatives, and increased elder and Aboriginal community involvement. Thank you again.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to all our panelists for very clear, succinct presentations. It's got us off to a good start. We'll now get into questions, answers, and dialogue. We have four senators on the list: Senator Cowan, Senator Munson, Senator Boisvenu, and Senator Cordy. But before I go to them, I want to remind everybody in the audience that you're welcome to participate in this as well. And if Mike and Alexi would tour around and pick up any names of people who want to make an intervention, there's microphones 7 and 30. And you'll have up to 3 minutes for comments or questions and answers. So, with that, let's get on to the first question and comment from Senator Cowan.
Thank you, and welcome, and thank you for not only being here today, but for the good work that you do in a very, very critical area. I think this whole intersection of criminal justice and mental health is something that Canadians need a greater understanding of, and the statistics you've given us and the stories you've told today about how it's not only failing the inmates and resulting in poor rehabilitation outcomes, but that in turn impacts on public safety, which everybody's very concerned about. In the last Parliament, I introduced a bill to bring a particular focus to this intersection between criminal justice and mental health by proposing that there be a special commission. And while there was, I think, general support for the objectives behind the bill, the Mental Health Commission in particular, supported by the government, said, well, you know, we're already doing this work. This would be a duplication of the work that's being done by the Mental Health Commission of Canada, and which itself, of course, was recommended by the Senate. So we take some pride in that. And they do a lot of good work, there's no question. But I recall at the time they were in the process of negotiating for an extension of their mandate, which was granted by the previous government, and that's good. But they were also renegotiating, if that's the right term, their mandate. And we hope that they would, I hope that they would have a greater focus on the issues we've addressed today in their mandate. I haven't seen that, and I haven't, in my follow-up with the Mental Health Commission, I haven't been encouraged, let me put it that way. So I wonder if you could comment on that, and whether, as you say, there's a role for the federal government, a leadership role that the federal government can play. Do you see the Mental Health Commission of Canada as being the vehicle to provide that leadership?
Well, you seem to be looking at Mr. Sapers, so I'll take him first. Well, I'll take him first.
Catherine and Howard we've had this interaction before, so I welcome comments from any of the panelists.
Yes, I wanted to just make that point. If you want to start by making comments, but anybody else that wants to join in after that is free to do that. Okay, Howard Sapers.
Thank you, and thank you for the questions, Senator. I'm a huge fan of the Mental Health Commission of Canada, and I think that their presence is a tribute to the Senate, and I remember very well participating in the consultations under the direction of Senator Kirby at the time, and led to that report, which we refer to as the Kirby report. It was on mental health and addiction, and there were a number of recommendations and some of those recommendations have actually fallen off the table. And a lot of it had to do with the relationship and comorbidity issues. There were also some specific issues raised in the Kirby report around corrections, and some of those things have fallen off the table. The Mental Health Commission of Canada has taken on a huge set of tasks to create a national framework and a national discussion and a national strategy for dealing with mental health throughout society. Their priorities include, of course, anti-stigma, very important work. But with all of that, some of the specific things that those of us who work in corrections would like to see focused on have really not had the attention that we believe they deserve and they require. I remember speaking to your bill, and our feeling is that a commission that focuses on mental health and corrections would be helpful. If that work could be incorporated into the work of not just the Mental Health Commission of Canada, but also the Canadian Centre for Substance Abuse and some of the other structures that already exist, that would be welcomed. I don't think we need more structure. I think we need more action, and that's always the potential criticism for things like this. But there's no doubt in my mind that I think Canadians would benefit from the presence, the existence of a place where these things won't fall off the table, where there will be a mandated accountability to deal with these issues and to focus the attention that only the federal government can give to these issues.
Okay. Anybody want to pick that up from there? Are you a doctor? Chaimowitz?
So thank you. I think that is the nub of the issue. So much has been written about this problem. In fact, as I was reviewing the piles of papers that have been written, and I was looking at some of the many reports that Mr. Sapers has put out, 2009, 2010, and the recommendations and the responses and the awareness that essentially not much has been done. So the question is, how do we take all of this that's written and that we know and turn this into something that actually is actionable, actioned? And I, again, think, the Mental Health Commission, which, again, I'm also a great fan, has in their 2.4 priority talked about this particular issue over a few pages. But taking what they've said and that strategy and combining that with a health accord where there are dollars and outcomes attached to these strategies is one way forward. There has to be an action. There has to be an implementation. And I think the federal government is well positioned as it negotiates around a health accord, the opportunities to enact the very things that we know so well and have known for many years.
Okay, agreement on that. All right.
La prochaine question par le Senator Munson.
Question by Senator Munson, and then Senator Boisvenu.
Thanks very much for being here. Thank you very much for being here. It's really important information, and to hear your story, Lee, is an incredible story to hear this morning. Ms. Latimer, you just gave me a great idea as chair of the Senate Human Rights Committee. We've been doing a lot of things about Syria and North Korea and other studies, but I think in the fall I should suggest to my colleagues we do a human rights of prisoners. I think it's just, it's timely, and I'm sure I can convince my colleagues on the Human Rights Committee to do that. But it's extremely, extremely important because we do forget once the doors are closed, don't we? Two quick questions. You talked about staff positions. and lack of qualifications. What qualifications are needed, and what mandatory qualifications perhaps should be there in staff positions. We've heard so much of what's been going on at Innes Road Jail here in Ottawa, and anybody can answer this question, and it's not pretty, no matter how provincial government dresses it up. It is not a good place. The other one has to do with just, and perhaps everybody knows the answer to this, when you talk about prisoners being moved from prison to prison. I've always wondered, and you talk about the medical requirements changing and so on, why are prisoners moved from prison to prison? We do live in a country with 2 official languages. We have a prisoner sitting in a prison in Alberta, and all of a sudden he or she, probably he, is in Bordeaux jail, where there's a whole different climate. And I'm just wondering, what's the necessity behind that? Is that to rehabilitate the prisoner, or is it just to make it tougher on the prisoner to adapt to yet another prison situation? Thank you.
Okay, Lee, would you like to comment?
Yes, thank you, sir, for your comments. And I would like to respond. In regards to transfers, there's a variety of reasons, certainly. I can point to the closure of Kingston Penitentiary as recently as September 2013, wherein bed space in Ontario simply wasn't available. So inmates who were Ontario-based were being transferred to all points of Canada, not willingly. We do have CDs that relate to proximity of family, realizing the importance of inmates being closer to their support networks and their communities. But there's one example. Good order of institution is another reason. So if I think we've known some fairly high-profile cases where transfers are done simply because there's just, rather than put work in and invest time with an individual transfer from place to place, it's there's another additional reason, and I can say this, I think it's important for anybody who's not aware, provincial institutions are very much play a huge role in this, even in a federal conversation. They are the jumping off point for all inmates who end up in the federal system. You don't get to the federal system without first being in the provincial system, often for years at a time. So continuity when it comes to healthcare certainly is applicable here. And there is one good reason, certainly, for transfers, and that is what we used to have in Canada, and I believe it's still remnants thereof, and that's a cascading. And that is, if you're starting with a serious sentence, a violent sentence, you start in a maximum security penitentiary. You can then earn your way down to a medium, a minimum. Minimums are the ones that tend to get the bad press for those who say that we're soft on crime, and I would venture to say we've never been. Our prisons have not been. But I believe it's important, the minimum securities and working your way, earn your way towards release, and it's certainly a benefit to all Canadians because a minimum security institution affords a period of decompression from the higher security once prior to being released to the street. And I think from a long view, as reintegration, that's certainly a very key important thing to hopefully encourage and continue with.
Other comments to that question asked by Senator Munson?
I think I may have been the one who raised about the qualifications, and it's a very good point, but I'm going to ask Howard Sapers, who's got more details about that, to respond, if you don't mind, Howard.
Sure. Thanks, Catherine, and thank you, Senator. With the staff vacancies, there's a constellation of issues. So in some cases, what you're dealing with is a high rate of vacancy. So this talks to the ability of the Correctional Service of Canada to recruit and retain certain categories of workers, particularly healthcare workers. This is not a unique challenge to the Correctional Service. A lot of competition to hire psychologists, to hire nurses, etc. But there are some unique features of providing that kind of work inside a correctional institution. So the healthcare professionals report that the reason why they either don't go to work for CSC or why they leave CSC has to do with opportunities for professional development, the nature of the work itself, the salary scale, and the working conditions. So remember, if a chaotic or unhealthy environment for inmates is also a chaotic, unhealthy environment for staff. And so sometimes people choose to leave that environment when they can. So that leads to vacancy rates. Vacancy rates leads to something that's referred to as being underfilled. So a quick example of that is, so you have a position that requires a psychologist, but you can't hire a psychologist to fill that position. You may give somebody some acting time who doesn't have the same qualifications and can't be certified to work as a psychologist, but may have some training and some skills and some ability. And I say this with no disrespect to the men and women who are doing that very challenging work, but in an underfilled capacity. And then the Correctional Service of Canada has also made some changes, particularly in how they develop correctional intervention programs, when they've changed the requirements for the individuals, the program delivering individuals who do that work. And so those requirements have actually been reduced in terms of their own educational preparation, et cetera. So you've got, as I say, you've got a number of issues that fill out the question around how come we have differently qualified and in some cases less than qualified staff doing very, very demanding work inside the institutions.
Can I just have a brief supplementary?
Yes, go ahead.
Because we are talking about mental health. I think it was a couple of years ago, prison farms were closed. I thought that was just stupid decision. And a good healthy day's work, even in my own home, my wife will put me out and say, start cleaning the yard, you'll feel better, right? So what's your position on that? Or...
On how stupid it was?
No. Well, I've heard you before, so you were given a rough ride at one time. But at the end of the day, do you feel that we should open up and have prisoners working outside and contributing to society?
Senator, there's no question that was an ill-considered decision. It was poorly thought out, and it was even more poorly executed. But it's not just prison farms. There's a broader issue at play here, and that is the role that the Correctional Service of Canada plays in properly preparing people for safe and timely release and for success in the community. And a lot of that has to do with educational opportunities and vocational opportunities to prepare people to compete in today's workforce. Now, prison farms are what was referred to as the agri-industries part of CORCAN, the operating agency that does some of the vocational work inside penitentiaries. Agri-industries were considered to no longer properly prepare people, and they were considered too expensive. It was the only time ever, in my experience, where I've seen somebody say, well, this correctional program just costs too much, so we're not even going to. That's it, because it doesn't pay for itself inside the institution. We're going to run it like a business, and so we're not going to go ahead. I've never seen an adequate justification for the closure of the farms, and I'm very encouraged by the recent announcement for the consultation that I hope will lead to the reopening of those opportunities as well as perhaps some others. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Maybe my speech will be different from those who are here. Firstly, I'm identified with the victim's defense. My daughter was assassinated by the recidivists. I'm very pessimistic in regards to the performance of correctional service. We're at 70% of recidivism. The system doesn't work. People come in and out all the time. We lose people. We waste resources, and we abandon families because often they go back to their family and they're more criminalized than when they came in. We have to think throughout the whole correctional service of Canada. Now, let's talk about mental health. I studied in that area. I worked in the disinstitutionalization in the 70s. so that people would not spend their whole life in a mental institution anyways in Quebec. If we look at the growth of the prison population and those who suffer from mental illness, it is proportional to the decrease of people who were taken out of institutions. There is a direct link between disinstitutionalization and the inmate population. They were just moved from one institution to the next. The question is not, should we offer more services in prisons? Should these people be in prisons to start with? And I think the answer is no. It's not the role of penitentiaries, provincial or federal, to deal with that clientele. It's up to the health department to take care of these people. All health departments are not committed towards that clientele. Mental health is the last of their concern. In Montreal, 2 people arrested by the police force suffer from mental conditions. So we have to have an alternative. And the best alternative are the pilot projects, which are called At Home, Chez Soi. I follow what's happening in Quebec, and we can reduce recidivism by 90% with the At Home program when they're freed from the jail, or if they are under a controlled environment, we control the ins and outs, we reduce the level of recidivism. A person that has a mental condition in a penitentiary costs $200,000 a year, and with the program At Home, it's $45,000 a year. So we can fund 4 inmates in a controlled environment with $200,000. We need more nurses in a controlled environment, access to medical services. That's where the solution lies. Otherwise, we will reinvest money, and it's an unending process. Let's set up a national commission, a non-political commission, so we can have alternative measures like the At Home program. We can invest these millions, because these millions are now in the correctional service. We will just move that money and invest it in better service, and families will be better off. Families always end up with the problem. So I think that's where the solution lies. Thank you, Senator Boisvenu.
John Howard Society have been on different sides of many issues, but I'm pleased to see that we're on the same side as this one. I think there is much that can be done in terms of providing alternatives in the community through some of these excellent Chez Soi programs and others that are more effective, less expensive, and more humane for dealing with mental health issues. So I absolutely agree.
Yeah, thank you. It is unfortunate that the access to mental health care for most Canadians is suboptimal. And this is not in prisons, but this is in the community. And I think it doesn't take much to look around and see how long it takes you to get an appointment if you're connected, and how poorly it is if you're not connected. Unless we invest in mental health care for all Canadians and increase access for mental health in all Canadians, we are going to see more of these tragedies, and we're going to see more people in prisons and detention centers. People need to obviously repay their debt to society, but as all inmates are ultimately, or most inmates are ultimately going to be released, unless we actually provide the sorts of rehabilitation that they deserve, they will come out harder and more criminalized than you can believe. That is Criminal University. So, increased funding for mental health services pre-offense, diversion, making sure that the sorts of tragedies that happen. I see people come for assessment for criminal responsibility. Some are responsible, some are not according to our laws. But I can tell you that many of the people who are responsible for their offenses, were it not for untreated mental illness, notwithstanding the fact that they're not criminally responsible, those offenses likely would not have occurred. This is a funding issue, this is a leadership issue, and it goes beyond prisons. It goes to the point of stigma, advocacy, and funding for mental health services before people get to the point where we see the tragedies and some of the disasters that fill our prison system.
Thank you.
Small supplementary from
Dernier
Senator
commentaire.
Bobineau.
Et docteur, c'est docteur ou professeur?
Doctor or professor? Doctor. The other problem in Canada is the silo management. People have mental conditions and they can end up at 16 or 17 in a youth center, eventually in a provisional prison, and eventually in a federal penitentiary. And those three don't talk to each other. It's as though at 14 I have a first cancer, then I reoffend at 20, 25, and the doctor will not consult the first diagnostic when I was 14. I will reoffend at 40, and the third doctor will not see what the other physician told me about my cancer. That's how we treat these people. There is no continuity along the way. From the moment a youth commits a crime at 16 till 40 years old, there is no follow-up, no continuity. And then we wonder why these youth of 17 end up with 20 years of jail at 40. We have to think about that and talk about the possibility of joint ventures between these establishments so we don't lose people along the way. These establishments don't talk to each other. If you go from a provincial prison to a federal prison, it's as though they're in the system for the first time. We forget the past of the inmate. How can you have good rehabilitation if those who deal with these inmates deal with them as though it was their first crime? It could be their 8th or 9th crime. I don't know if you share my opinion. Thank you.
Merci, Senator. The issue
Thank you, Senator.
is an important one in terms of the silos and not learning from past mistakes. So I see it with really those two elements. We have jurisdictional challenges, provincial versus federal, young offenders versus adult offenders, sentences of 2 years less a day versus federal sentences more than 2 years. We also have challenges in the professional communities, scope of practice for the various healthcare providers, provincial regulations that don't always match the mobility of those individuals across jurisdictions. You have a federally sentenced offender we've talked about being involuntarily transferred from one place to another, may end up with different treatment regimes, may end up with different, even from province to province, may end up with different formularies in terms of medications that are available or medical procedures that are offered. So lots of challenges, well outside often of even the criminal justice system. Even if we could get the criminal justice system to actually work as a system, we still have to figure out how to integrate that into the healthcare system, the social welfare systems, the educational systems. Lots of good work going on about that, but you know, sadly, I remember having some of these integration and silo-busting conversations when I started my career 30 years ago. So I guess the work will continue.
Okay, going to move on. I want to welcome Senator Grant Mitchell, independent senator, and Senator Runciman, who is here from the Conservative Caucus. I've got you down. I've got Senator Cordy, Senator Merchant, Senator Joyal, Senator Hubley, and then Senator Runciman on the list, and then second time for Senator Cowan. Plus, I got 5 people from the audience, so I'm going to have to work everybody in here in about the next 40, 50 minutes. So we'll have to keep things clear, succinct, brief. I'm going to take 2 from the audience at this point in time and then come back later for the rest. Janet Tusunyan. Microphone 30.
Hi, my name is Jeanette Tasunian, and I spent 2 years in the provincial institutions. I spent lots of time, and most of my time was in maximum security and in segregation. I am a normal functioning person in society with no mental illnesses. However, I had the option where I could have been diagnosed with a mental illness and medicated just to get me through incarceration, and I did not agree on that when I was in there. I am just wondering if this meeting is all about repackaging incarceration from criminal institutions, jails, to medical institutions, mental health institutions. I've read a lot of wonderful literature, self-educated throughout history, books from a couple of thousand years and on, and it seems like I'm watching history repeat itself from the people who are overeducated leaders in society, looking at the poor, wondering what you're going to do about them, and just stick them in institutions. While I was in jail, most of the people in the institutions I don't think belong there at all, and I think they would be better if they were just in better circumstances in life. I think we need to be concentrating on what brings people institutions and stop putting people in institutions and just shifting them from one institution to another. Most of the women I was in jail, I think, should have been home with their children, taking care of them, or having jobs. Only a very few percent, I would think, had some really severe mental disabilities, and if you're just going to overpackage everybody as some mental case and just stick them in an institution, those few that actually have some serious issues will not get the attention they need at all. So, I'm just listening to you guys talk, and I'm like going, I don't think I see anything really happening here. If you're not going to, basically my question here for you guys, when are you guys going to start dealing with the issues that bring people into institutions to begin with, and stop taking them as children and saying, oh, that person's just mentally ill, let's stick them into an institution, and they're just going to be institutionalized for the rest of their life. I personally don't like the fact that my hard-working, tax-paying dollars has put me into an institution, especially when I was wrongfully convicted, but that's another story. Seriously, I don't want to see any more institutionalized of people. There are some serious criminals out there, sure, stick those people in jail. Most of the people in jail are not serious criminals, don't need to be there, it's life circumstances. Stop institutionalizing people. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 more from the audience, and then I'll come to the panel for any comments that they may have. So if panelists could make notes. Next is Joel Watts from the Canadian Academy of Psychiatry and the Law.
Hello, everybody. I just want to thank very much my colleague, Dr. Chaimowitz, and Mr. Sapers, who do excellent work in this area. I'm the Vice President of the Canadian Academy of Psychiatry and Law, and also the President of the Quebec branch. I also work here in Ottawa at the Royal Ottawa Mental Health Centre in forensic psychiatry, so I'm quite familiar with a lot of these issues that you've been debating today. Specifically, I want to ask you, specifically the parliamentarians in the room, to consider revisiting funding issues related to programs in the correctional system. Previously, I worked in Montreal at the forensic psychiatric hospital there, the Institut Philippe Pinel de Montréal. And while I was there, I was involved in the program funded by Correctional Service of Canada to treat sex offenders. And that program's funding was cut when I was basically the clinical lead of that program. And over the years, I've seen in my work in forensic psychiatry that more and more cuts have been made, and there's this dwindling away of resources to who I would argue are the most stigmatized and the most vulnerable individuals in the correctional system. Individuals who have mental illness, but then individuals who have mental illness whose illnesses happen to be sexually related. These are individuals who, contrary to popular belief, can be treated and have lower recidivism rates than general offenders. And so I would strongly encourage you to consider funding programs again, and particularly look at programs
that correctional service can affiliate with in the community. In particular, I would encourage you to look at the Circles of Support and Accountability programs. I just also want to touch on some comments from Ms. Latimer as well. Those of us in forensic psychiatry in Canada are quite dismayed and worried about the consequences of the Not Criminally Responsible Reform Act. So far, it's very early days, and we don't have specific numbers, but I can tell you in my work here in Ottawa, at the Mental Health Court in Ottawa, I am regularly seeing defense attorneys more and more dissuading their clients from considering an NCR defense for whom there would be a legitimate NCR defense. These are individuals who perhaps present a higher risk of violence and would be better served, and the public would in fact be safer if they were actually in the forensic mental health system, but they're being told to go away from this by their defense attorneys because they're being told that there's this harbinger of the possible high-risk offender, high-risk accused label, and this is scaring them off. So I'm going to limit my comments to that and would invite comments from those of you who are aware of these issues, and thank you for listening to my comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Watts. I'll go one more, and then we'll get some comments from the panel and then back to the senators. Kim Pate, the Elizabeth Fry Society.
Thank you very much, and thank you for hosting this forum, and thank you to my colleagues for their presentations. That was great. And thank you for those with lived experience about this, some of whom you've heard from, Jeanette, and there are others in the room who may be a little shyer about speaking out, but thank you for all that you guys have taught all of us as well. And I want to pick up on a couple of themes. As the Chamber of Sober Second Thought, I think it's wonderful you've done this forum. I would like to encourage and inspire all of you to have the courage now to really take on this issue in a forward-thinking way, and I really appreciate Senator Munson's comment. I think we'd be happy to see an examination. But picking up on one of the comments Jeanette made, I think right now one of the issues that you could take leadership on is to really demand national standards be reinstated for healthcare, education, social services in a way that would help prevent some of this, and some of the rest of you have spoken about that. You could also look at some of the YCGA-style changes that, and Catherine Latimer is expert on this because she was instrumental in it, in looking at directing judges to first look to other approaches, whether it's mental health, education, social service approaches with individuals before they actually criminalized and certainly imprison them. You also, I would echo what Michelle said around some of the 718(2)E provisions. The other pieces that I would encourage you to do is right now in the existing legislation, in addition to Section 72 that says every one of you and every judge in this country can rock up to a prison and go in, I encourage you to do that. We've been encouraging judges when we're doing judicial education series to actually do that, go into prisons. The other things you could be doing and encouraging the Correctional Service of Canada and others to implement right away are Section 29 of the Corrections and Conditional Release Act allow for prisoners to be transferred out for health reasons. Mental health is a health reason. That could be being done right now. Section 81 and Section 84 allow people to serve their prison sentences in community and or be released into community on conditional release, particularly for Indigenous prisoners. And Section 77 and Section 80 of the Corrections and Conditional Release Act require that specific approaches be taken with women and Indigenous prisoners, and that allows you to then combine that with those other provisions, and I would say with the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the increasing call, including just over 10 days ago from Madam Justice, or the Honourable Louise Arbour, Madam Justice as she was, to get rid of segregation entirely for those with mental health issues, for women in particular, and also for Indigenous prisoners. And I think we could be looking at alternatives. Corrections recently said they only have 8 women left in prison. While we might dispute that, or in segregation, while we might dispute that number, we would be willing to work intensively with all of those individuals to get them out of those situations. So I encourage you to really push for some of those decarceration strategies that consistently are being recommended, and would be happy to assist in any of those measures. So thank you very much, and it's very nice to see all of you.
Thank you very much, Kim Pate. Okay, so on those 3 interventions, comments from the panel? Dr. Chaimowitz?
Go ahead. Okay, thanks. Thank you. So on some of the points that Dr. Watts brought up, our forensic psychiatry system in Canada does articulate a caring and humanistic approach to individuals whose mental illness runs them into conflict with the law. With the new act that Dr. Watts addressed, there is an absolute, and I would agree with him, an absolute withdrawal of applications for NCR findings and requests with a drop-off in the NCR population. Whether you agree with that or not, what is very clear is the data suggests that if an individual with a mental illness is treated in the forensic system, the NCR system, their recidivism rate is significantly lower than it is if they enter the federal or provincial systems. So something has to be done about that. It has really changed the face of what was a thoughtful, caring, and ethical approach to mental illness and criminal behavior. So there's something we can do in terms of rolling that back. Dr. Watts also mentioned sex offenders. If anything, and sexual disorders, if anything is going to get members of the public, of our society, upset or concerned, it is sexual offenses. But I want to leave you with I want to leave you with this particular thought. The only way, if you're a potential sex offender, the only way you can get treatment in this country is to offend. You cannot find treatment anywhere ahead of your offense. There are other jurisdictions. Germany has a tremendous experiment which appears to be working, where if you have the potential to offend and you're prepared to enter a program, you can get treatment and will not be reported outside of that treatment area until we deal with this. So the way we deal with some of these things are sound bites. You offend, we'll lock you up forever. But if we can do something ahead of time, can you imagine what we could do? The last thing I actually want to talk about is just mention is segregation. In psychiatric facilities, I mentioned this earlier on, across this country, we have reduced the use of seclusion, the equivalent of segregation, tremendously. It boggles the minds of those of us that worked in psychiatry who never thought that would have happened. I think if we took the lead on that, the spill-off and the generalization of the idea that there are more humane ways of dealing with administrative segregation and understanding the traumatized experience of the people that have been in segregation, going into segregation, and their past histories will, I think, generalize and perhaps change the flavor of the way we deal with people in our prisons in general. So I think there are many things, and I think the federal government can take the lead in all of these things as it brings together the jurisdictions and the silos that, that hold us up.
Thank you. Anybody else? No? Mr. Sapers?
Thank you. Just a couple of very quick reflections on the comments, and I was struck by what Jeanette had to say, and it made me, I actually linked it to what Senator Balvenu was saying about setting up alternative measures for families and dealing with supportive housing, et cetera. Because I do think that in a discussion like this, we tend not to look at root causes. We tend to look at how the system is operating and how various components of it might be tweaked or fixed. But going back to the starting point and the pathways that people are on that to take them into conflict with the law, it's very important. So if people want more insight into what Jeanette was, she's written a book, which I think will tell you a little bit about her own pathway. So we shouldn't lose sight of that, although I am in a very privileged position that I just think about one little narrow thing, and that's the rule of law and compliance with law and policy in federal corrections. So it's a little different. But I was also struck by what Dr. Watts had to say, particularly when he talked about revisiting some of the funding decisions for programs in federal corrections. I recently just heard from Ireland that they are looking, in part based on the Canadian experience, Canadian innovations, which are circles of support and accountability for sex offenders, and also the Lifeline program, which was really a program of peer support of life-sentenced offenders serving their sentence successfully in the community, helping life-sentenced offenders making their transition from institution to community. And both circles of support and Lifeline funding has been cut. Yet these innovations, which are considered to be Canadian success stories elsewhere in the world, are now being implemented, and as I say, most recently in Ireland. So I think we should maybe take a look at some of those decisions and see whether or not they need to be reconsidered.
Yes.
I'm just going to add, it wasn't in my bio, but I also, over the last few years, have been acting as a per diem criminal duty counsel. So from the perspective of someone who's done a lot of bail court with respect to early interventions, certainly on the youth front, while this isn't specific to mental health, I can't tell you how many times I was in bail court with someone under 18 and there was no one there for them. And even more specifically, I think the angriest I've ever been is having people who were under 16 and there was no one there for them. And even by law, it's required that someone is appearing, when someone's under 16 years old, and having no resources for those individuals. And the other thing I would say, again, about addressing the mental health issues earlier in the process, I did a lot of weekend bail court, which is kind of the craziest time because, John Howard isn't available. You don't have the opportunity to line things up, and you have a lot of clients. I would have the police charge sheet, and I would have 5 minutes on the phone with a client, from the police cells. And on that basis, I would be making a determination as to whether I thought I should offer a referral to mental health court for their bail hearing the next week. And I mean, I am not a psychiatrist. I am not an expert on mental health, and the time pressures of doing bail court on the weekend, and yet at the same time that I've got this pressure to participate in representing, or could we say processing, 5, 6, 8, 10 individuals in 2 hours. I'm also making that call at least at the outset as to whether they are, just from the police charge sheet and from my conversation with them on the phone, do I make a recommendation for mental health court? So that's just an issue, I think, at the very beginning of catching those individuals, and a lot of them are slipping through the cracks because it's not being caught.
Okay, going to have to move along. We've got 5 senators. I got 3 more from the floor. I'll come back to the floor a little bit later. And so everybody will have to keep the questions as brief as you can and the answers the same. Senator Cordy.
Thank you. So I'll ask all my questions in one. I thank you all very much. These presentations have been excellent, as have been the comments from the audience here today. I think what I was struck most by is that we need more action. We don't need more reports. We've had a lot of reports, a lot of really good suggestions. Mr. Sapers, you've had written many reports over the years which have provided some excellent information and some recommendations. And unfortunately, we're still talking about some of your recommendations that have not been fulfilled. I guess, first of all, I'd like to talk about segregation, which others have spoken about, that it should be at the minimum limited or at the maximum eliminated totally. I thought that was one of the recommendations in the Ashley Smith report, which goes back quite a number of years ago, and still we're talking about segregation and the ramifications of people who are segregated for up to 180 days, which is just unthinkable that would happen. Staffing was another issue that Senator Munson raised, and he spoke about the challenge of working in the prison system. But Mr. Sapers, in one of your reports, you referred to the staffing of the mental health professionals a few years ago as being a revolving door, that it was difficult to recruit mental health professionals for the prison system, but then retention was an absolute problem. So what do we do to retain them? Mr. Chapelle, I was struck by your comments that you were able to get help in the early 2001, I think you said, and you said that in the 80s and the 90s with the charter and a lot of things that were happening with rights for prisoners, that it seemed to be easy to access help for mental health challenges, and you weren't sure that would happen in 2016. So I wonder if you could tell us, what do we have to do in 2016 to ensure that prisoners who need help are getting it?
Okay, we'll start with Mr. Chapelle.
Thank you. You know, it's an interesting subject. I've been in prison for a long period of time, as recently as 2010. I work with people that are there today. This is wonderful, the dialogue. I think there's a lot of promise. I can say that throughout all my years inside, not once did I have a conversation with a correctional officer or another inmate about mental health. Inside, we don't talk about this. There's masks, you gotta put on, I mean, it's a different world, you gotta put on a front. So this subject is not discussed internally, for one. And I would say that in the 80s and 90s, certainly following the 70s, which was a horrible period of time, with riots and the birth of the Parole Board of Canada and the Correctional Service of Canada, and a move towards a stronger rehabilitative model, looking at causality, looking at, which is really the direction we were in. We don't have to look that far back to where we were on the right track. It was 80s, 90s, the birth of the CCRAs, the CCRRs. These things were, I mean, really, it was there. Help was there if you wanted it. And if you wanted to work towards overcoming, coming out, and having reintegration was there. Community corrections, there was more of a direction. There was an agenda of having more inmates on the street at that time. Over the course of the last decade or so, we've certainly reverted to, I believe, something that's ineffective, and certainly that doesn't result in public safety. We've had rhetoric of safer communities. We've had rhetoric of tough on crime. Frankly, you know, it's ineffective from my perspective. I can speak to coming out from solitary confinement, and it was an aberration. It was in 1991 in Millhaven Maximum Security. Due to some restructuring of the institution at the time, I was thrown in the hole for making brew, moonshine, drink. I was serving a relatively short sentence, and my last 4 months, regardless of how it came to be, were spent in administrative segregation. I was released directly to the street on December 21st, 1990, and I can tell you in retrospect, I stood no chance. I was dizzy by everything around me. I was absolutely overloaded, and the only thing I did manage to do was report to my parole officer, because that was a direct order that I had. And when I left that office downtown Toronto, I ran away. And that led to further crimes, and that led to a number of things. But just to say that I've had the experience of being released directly from solitary confinement, and I'll tell you, it's not a recipe for success, and nor do I believe it ever will be. So again, I don't think we have to look that far back. We could look at a Commissioner of Corrections, Ole Engstrup, who had great, I believe, and I think importantly, pushed for internal accountability from the Correctional Service of Canada. And that's lacking right now too. I think this punitive culture has allowed the internal accountability to dissipate. So anyway.
I think you also had a question, Mr. Sapers. Yes. Yes, no? You want to comment?
I don't think I can add very much to that, Senator. If there was something specific, I did take your point about some of the reports and the recommendations, and sometimes we say them again and again and again and again, and we'll continue to do so on the important issues. And you know, incremental progress is what we've come to expect. But maybe discussions like today's discussion will speed it up, maybe shorten the interval between the incremental progress. So thank you.
Thank you. We're going to have to speed it up, talking about speeding up. Senator Merchant, followed by Senator Joyal.
Thank you, and my thanks to all of you. You have talked about, I'm going to just have one question. You have talked about the prison system and how we treat people when they come out. I'm going to draw it back to mental health. From some of the things that you have said, you estimate, you know, the number of people that have mental health problems in prison. I don't know why we can't give some more accurate numbers. But am I to understand from what you have said that people that suffer from a mental health issue are more likely to offend, because often people that have mental health issues are not violent people? And frequently, the treatment out in society, not in prisons, but in society generally, that we give to people with mental illness is medication, which they may or may not take. So in prison, what do you do? Do you want to give medication to everybody in prison because you deem that because they have offended, they have a mental illness? Or I don't understand. I know about the prison system. I have heard your concerns about the money that we have to put in the prison system, but I'm wondering how to link that to mental illness.
I'd like to go. Yes, Senator. Yes, Mr. Sapers, or Ms. Latimer?
Yeah, I mean, you're raising a very interesting discussion about what constitutes mental illness and what the breadth of that definition should be. And I think it's very important that we be very cautious about, because if you look at mental well-being, and it's sometimes wrapped into definitions around mental health, just about everybody who's in a prison could be defined as having a mental health issue. But I think we really need to look at the ones where you're talking about a relatively serious mental health issue or a condition like ADHD that can be addressed through a regime, a medical regime, which these people should be entitled to access as equally as if they were on the outside. I absolutely agree with you. I think it's not a good assumption to say that everybody inside is mentally ill. A lot of them are suffering from anxiety and depression and a lot of other trauma in their lives, which are imminently addressable and maybe in some cases situationally related. But I think we need to be mindful of the pressures on individual prisoners if we're going to work towards their effective rehabilitation and reintegration, and understanding their background, maybe even some cognitive issues like brain injury or FASD or other things that may be affecting their ability to cope well within the prison structure. It's very important in terms of advancing their rehabilitation. Not all of it should be treated, and I would say you do a disservice to the prison population by thinking that they're predominantly mentally ill. So I think we collectively need to be a bit cautious. But there are people who've defaulted into the criminal justice system who are seriously mentally ill. We're talking about people with diagnosed schizophrenia. I mean, they're basically in episodes of psychosis, and you can't leave them alone. Like, they need to be addressed. Those issues need to be addressed.
Okay, I've got three more senators, Joyelle, Hubley, and Runciman. If I could get you to ask your questions, then I'll come back to the panel for a response on all three of you at the same time, and then I'll go to the floor for the last three people that I have there.
Senator Joyelle.
Senator Joyelle.
Thank you. I want to join with Senator Boisvenu on his suggestion that, considering the fact that, especially for Aboriginal offenders, there is the revolving door, syndrome, I should say. It's always the same people. Most of the time, it's the same people coming back. And many of them, as you have stated, have had health problem. I wonder, as Mrs. Kim Pate is suggesting, that there shouldn't be stricter directives to judges to evaluate the mental condition of the person before sentencing that person, especially if that person is a second, third, fourth time in front of a judge. It's clearly that the problem has not been solved. So to send that person back in prison is just perpetuating, in my opinion, a weakness that will never be cured. So we are, in fact, the author of our own turpitude by maintaining those people in the prison system. My other question is in relation to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada report. There are a series of recommendations, recommendation 25 to 42. I wonder, Mr. Sapers, if you are involved in the implementation of those recommendations and other members at the panel, at the table, because since the Prime Minister is committed to give effect to all those recommendations, there are recommendations there. I won't read them, of course, we don't have time, but there are certainly recommendation 34 about the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. There are 4 suggestions, the recommendation 30. Are you involved in the process of implementation of those recommendations? And how, if not, how can you be involved to be sure that there'll be action in relation to that?
Okay, hold those responses. Over to Senator Hubley.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. In 2011, the Canadian Psychiatric Association severely critiqued the fact that mentally ill inmates were often put in solitary confinement. In 2012, the UN Committee Against Torture reported that Canada must stop using solitary confinement for the mentally ill inmates. In March of 2016, the Correctional Investigator of Canada stated in his annual report that CSC should prohibit the use of solitary confinement for mentally ill inmates. CSC today is still using solitary confinement for mentally ill prisoners. I might ask why and who should stop this and when. And my other question, which you may or may not get an answer to, I was just going to, in support of prison workers, wondering what education and training that they receive. Thank you.
Okay, Senator Runciman, please.
My question is really, do you agree with my brief rant? I think that significant change here has to be initiated by the government and has to play a much more activist role. I think too often over the past probably decades, ministers and governments have deferred to senior corrections officials in terms of the operation of the system. And we go back to Ashley Smith and look at how corrections were dealing with the Ashley Smith inquest and the resistance within corrections. From the top down, they fought the mandate of the inquest. They fought the release of the videos. They fought the appearance of the director at the inquest. This all cost millions and millions of tax dollars. It finally came to light, I guess, when Bob Ray raised it in question period, and there was some action taken. But then the commissioner who finally did appear and lounged in his chair and looked like he'd just come in from working in the garden, in my view, was an indication of his contempt for the whole process. And that carries on today, as Mr. Sapers can indicate, I think, in his report, his last report, when he's looking for an update on the government's or corrections responses to the Ashley Smith inquest recommendations, they're not giving them to him. I went through the Library of Parliament as well to try and get that kind of a breakdown and how they're responding to those over 100 recommendations. Again, the same kind of response. So that attitude within the leadership group in corrections, unless there's some kind of a significant wholesale change there and a more progressive approach to how we deal with these significant challenges, I don't think we're going to see a lot of change. I've met with the last 5 solicitors general, ministers of corrections, and Senator Baker and I just met this past week with Minister Goodale. We've been talking, and Ashley Smith talked about it. The Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee made recommendations with respect to alternative service delivery. We've seen great success at the provincial level and great resistance. So we, the senators and I delivered that message, the committee's message, and we're hopeful that the new government will act. But there's been a lot of frustration over the years, and I don't think until we see a significant house cleaning, we're going to see a lot of change.
Okay, so a lot of material there in terms of responses. Who wants it? Dr. Chaimowitz?
Thank you. A lot of good points. I just want to say one thing very clearly. Most violence in this world is not committed by people with mental illness. Just make that clear. There are certain circumstances where untreated people can be aggressive, but violence and mental illness, that equation can cloud our judgment. I will say that psychotic disorders, which are eminently treatable, if you want to see somebody look like magic going from very, very unwell to very well with psychiatric medications, an untreated psychotic disorder is it. We can save lives with medication. The fact is that in our correctional system, for the most part, with some exceptions, the legal environment does not allow us to treat people with untreated psychotic disorders who don't want medications. So they languish for days, for weeks, for months, and sometimes years in administrative segregation because they don't have the legal tools or the resources to treat them. So I think that's one thing we can absolutely do. I think access to appropriate care, I think, should be a basic requirement of every Canadian, no matter where they are. And I think we would be horrified to find that if we looked at some of the UN Commission's writings, what we do has been and will be equated with torture. It is written, and we fit right square into that definition in a number of areas. So I think attitudes need to change, but I also appreciate that courts, the police, corrections work with an inordinate load. And I know there's this other statement about, never hate your enemies because it clouds your judgment. But I think we actually need to understand the perspectives of all the players here, because they all have a perspective. And unless we can come together and as a group of Canadians, hopefully led by a federal initiative, pull this together, we're not going to go anywhere. We're going to just write some more reports. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Mr. Sapers? Do any of the questions from Alderman Joyal, Senator Joyal, Senator Hubley, and Senator Runciman?
Thank you. Thank you. Boy. Senator Joyal, actually, I'd like to make a linkage, Senator, between your comments and some of the questions from Senator Runciman as well. Senator Joyal, you talked about the Aboriginal offenders and this shameful overrepresentation and the fact that it just keeps on getting worse, and the revolving door. And Senator Runciman, you were talking about leadership. And one of the areas where the Correctional Service of Canada and I significantly disagree is about how to introduce leadership into that component of corrections. And my office has made the recommendation, for example, that there should be a deputy commissioner for Indigenous offenders, for Indigenous corrections, much as there is for women and much as there is for health. We think that kind of leadership will bring focus and accountability. There's also leadership over and above what the Correctional Service of Canada and of course, the executive management table at CSC, and that's some of the messages I think that organization received from changes in legislation over the last number of years. The Corrections and Conditional Release Act, which Lee has been talking about, was seen as a very progressive and hopeful piece of legislation when it was proclaimed into law in 1992, but much of that's been eroded. Language changes, particularly over the last 10 years, that have changed the principles section of that legislation and given different kinds of direction to the Correctional Service of Canada. So in some ways, it's very hard to fault the leadership of an organization when they're trying to keep pace with the very rapid number of parliamentary changes that happened over the last decade. There was also a very specific question about whether my office is involved in the government's commitment to implement the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I thank you very much for raising that issue. I have written both the Ministers of Indigenous Affairs and Justice and offered the expertise and experience of my office in working on some of those areas, particularly around FASD and corrections and the Aboriginal specific sections of the Corrections and Conditional Release Act. I'm still waiting for an answer. I understand that they're still developing their responses to the thousands of inquiries that they've received. So I'll stay tuned, and I will keep you informed as well, sir. Senator Hubley asked about why does CSC continue to use segregation when there's so many voices saying that it shouldn't be used for some populations and should be used differently for others. I can tell you there's some good news there. In the first quarter of this fiscal year, we've seen the number of segregation placements and the number of individuals placed in segregation, two different counts, actually go down, and go down quite dramatically. And this is the result of focused attention and organizational will to fully comply, or more fully comply, with the legal and policy framework around segregation. So this decrease in the use of segregation has not been driven by legislation. It's not been driven by policy. It's been driven by doing good casework. And so I'm hopeful about that. And I think with some legislative change and with some improved policy, it can be reduced. It can be reduced even more. And maybe we can move on to some other recommendations.
Okay.
I was just going to also respond to Senator Hubley's question about why there hasn't been movement on the administrative segregation front. And while I take Howard's point that there has been some success in reducing the numbers, many of us feel that unless this is buttressed by legislative requirements, that it may just be a flash in the pan and not something that has any sustaining power. And many of our organizations, when we saw the response to the Ashley Smith, said, okay, well, obviously good evidence and good policy advice is not going to cut it. So many of us are in the process of litigation against the federal government, challenging whether or not their use of these administrative segregation provisions are consistent with charter rights of prisoners. So I think it had to get to the litigation phase, which is most unfortunate because I think the evidence is fairly clear that what is happening shouldn't be happening.
Okay, Ms. Mann-Rempel.
I was just going to respond to Senator Joyal's question about implementation of the TRC report and FASD. And I think it also, we haven't really talked very much about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder today, but I think Howard or perhaps the doctor might know estimates, but the estimates are very high, I believe, as to the percentage of the federal offender population that may be impacted by FASD. And at the very least, those individuals need ameliorated, distinctive programming in order to be able to be effectively rehabilitated. And Kim Pate's recommendation that, perhaps there could be stricter directives to judges regarding the evaluation of mental health. I mean, one problem we know we have with FASD are the lack of assessment and diagnostic tools. So judges just don't have that at their fingertips when they're sentencing an offender. And particularly, we even know that there have been circumstances where judges have seen that something is wrong. They have ordered an assessment, and then because it's been viewed as being outside of their jurisdiction, they've been overturned. So there certainly is a dire shortage of accessibility of FASD diagnostic and assessment tools. And again, also for Aboriginal offenders, they would need to have a culturally specific component to them as well. So.
Okay, we are on overtime, but let me try to get the last three comments in from the floor, and then I'll come back to the panel if it has any final observations to make. So the three people I have are Dr. Don Moore from Carleton University, Anne London Weinstein, and Farhat Raymond. So starting with Dr. Moore.
Thank you. Thank you for this event this morning. I really appreciate the attention that's been paid to this issue. Senator Runciman, I apologize. I may appear like I've just come out of gardening myself. But I assure you it was just a lack of will to get dressed up today, but it means no disrespect to this body. I have been a critical prison researcher for the last 20 years, and I'd like to invite this body to consider the role of academics within this issue. At the moment, we are in a very difficult situation for those of us who are considered quote-unquote critical researchers. At all levels of incarceration, there is a monopoly, with all due respect to my colleagues who do psychological or psychiatric-based research. There's a monopoly there that tends to squeeze out those of us who do more critical social justice-oriented research around incarceration. And what happens as a result is that we have a dark space of knowledge around incarceration. Kim spoke earlier about the importance of chronicling lived experiences of prisoners, and I want to underscore this, that there are many issues that we can get at if we can get access to those who are incarcerated, including over-pathologization of people who have been labeled as medically ill, over-medication, accessing the complaints process, which hasn't been talked about at all this morning, as well as locating these issues in a broader social context. And I will say I'm also part of a network, an international network of prison scholars, and I am slightly ashamed to tell you that Canada has the worst track record of any country in terms of critical prison research, in terms of giving researchers access to prisons. And I think this is particularly problematic given that most of us are working under federal grants from the Tri-Council. Our research has been deemed worthwhile as far as the taxpayers are concerned, as far as our peers are concerned. We are working for the taxpayers in the public interest as public scholars, and most of us are routinely being denied access to public institutions. And so I think as part of the picture, we need to think about who is getting access to prisons and who is able to ask the critical questions that need to be asked about incarceration. And in turn to recognize that we have, as critical scholars, quite a lot to offer to this conversation, but we need to be able to get in and do the research first. And for the last 20 years that I've been doing this work, I have never once been granted access. And I think this is an egregious problem. It's an egregious offense to that dark space of knowledge that we have. And it's an egregious problem in terms of being able to chronicle those day-to-day lived experiences of prisoners in a rigorous manner. We would love to be able to give you more information, but until we are able to get access, we can't do that. And I do strongly believe that the information that we would be able to generate in terms of gaining access to people who are currently incarcerated would help to inform best practices, would help to inform the broader social context in which people are living both inside and once they're released. So I just want to put that out there on the table for you, that this is a problem that is ongoing. I have other colleagues in the room who have encountered the same situation. And I am currently working right now on a project called the Prison Transparency Project with 4 other scholars across the country. And the best we can do at the moment is get stories from people who are now released, which is a start. And we hope will give us a platform on which to make the case yet again that we need to be able to get access to incarcerated people. But thus far, CSC and the provincial correctional services have stonewalled us. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Anne London Weinstein.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Anne London Weinstein. I'm the president of the Defence Counsel Association of Ottawa, and I'm also a former director of the Criminal Lawyers Association. And like Ms. Latimer this morning, I find myself in complete agreement with Senator Boisvenu for the first time ever in recorded history, which perhaps speaks to the magnitude of this problem. I would just like to make the suggestion, to reinforce the suggestion, that whatever approach we take on a federal level, that this be a joint provincial and federal initiative, because the problems apply to both, and many of our offenders begin in the provincial system, where, as Professor Mann-Rempel said, a simple lack of time in order to figure out whether someone's got a mental health issue or not, because of time compressions in the provincial system, may eventually lead to somebody further down the road becoming involved in the federal system. The problems are the same, the mental health issues are the same, and our concerns about public safety are also the same. Anecdotally, in Ottawa, we have a jail which is quite notorious, and I won't go into detail about it, but there was a young man recently who committed suicide because he was in segregation and had displayed mental health issues. There also was a young man who was, and these are people who are mostly on remand, so there's been no finding of guilt. They are presumed innocent in law. There was a young man who was waiting for his trial and spent almost a year in segregation and literally lost his mind while he was waiting for his trial. So the issues are very similar, and I believe, I mean, I'm not an insider to the politics of how these things work, but we could save ourselves a lot of money and time if we overcame the jurisdictional obstacles and developed one joint strategy that we could use for all mental health professionals to access all prisoners in the provincial and in the federal system. Thank you.
Thank you. Final person from the floor is Farhat Rehman. I hope I pronounced that right.
Hi. I'm very grateful to be sitting here and hearing
things at your level of government and all the stakeholders that it's sometimes I have to pinch myself and see if this is real. But I'm very, very happy to be here and listening to all your recommendations and the presentations. I'm a mother of an incarcerated young man. Well, he's not young anymore. Just 3 days prior to his 30th birthday, he was put in prison for a very serious crime that he committed. From age 17 to that day, I had been struggling to get help for him. He was in and out of the Royal Ottawa Hospital, and during the end of that time, he was really not very well being taken care of and got angrier, and then this happened. He's now 45 years old, and he's still at the federal penitentiary. And during the course of that time, he has had many relapses and psychosis, which was not one of the manifestations of his illness. He was only diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive behavior and a severe depression. So with the obsessive-compulsive behavior, there are so many elements that the experts like Dr. Chaimowitz will know. They're very scrupulous and very observant, and he was very religiously observant. So for his time in remand for the 4 years, he was declared unfit to stand trial, and observing these meticulous rituals, he would be taunted and berated for his behavior. One time, just one example, he asked for some extra water to swallow his pill, and they give you that little tiny water. And the nurse declined to give it to him, and then a male guard came and told him that in Canada, we treat our women with respect. And this is all because he had asked for extra water. Maybe he got angry, I don't know. But he's born in Canada and raised here. And also, he became very religiously observant. So one day, his prayer mat was put on the toilet. He found that. So all this to say that it just exacerbated his condition. So he was unfit to stand trial, and then the last year he spent at the Royal Ottawa. So this is 5 years of remand. And so he, in the federal prison, he's, of course, had a lot of relapses over the years, but, he was thrown into segregation at one point where all his personal belongings were taken away from him, and he was put in an empty cell with just the food slot. And so he loves learning. He was quite functional by then. He was working. He was, actually tutoring French and English and math to the other inmates. So he was thrown in segregation without his things, and that traumatized him to no degree. Even to this day, after years had passed, he would go over all that he was lost. They were very expensive dictionaries and music and recorded stuff that was taken. So now, fast forward to 2016, we are he has improved so much more over the years for some reason, and doesn't have the psychosis, and he's at a medium security, and now we're trying to get the parole. But for the parole, the same principles apply as to the regular inmates, so from the general population. So he hasn't cascaded down, even though it's been 15 years and he's eligible for parole. So he hasn't cascaded down. But one of the things that I would like to point out is the recommendations that have come from so many of you, and Howard Saper and Catherine Latimer, you've touched on those. We would love to see these recommendations implemented and consideration given for the lived history of the individual while sentencing and while paroling. And That's all I have to say.
Thank you very much.
I just wanted to say that I'm part of this mothers group. We are mothers offering mutual support, and I'm not alone in this because we hear the story every month when we come together to meet. So it is fervently hoped that some legislation and some implementation of the recommendations will come forward.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'll ask panelists to either respond to the three presentations we've had there, or any closing comments that you may have. Where do you want to start? Okay, Howard Sapers.
Oh, I was actually...
Okay, well, you know what? I'll come around, go in reverse order. Ms. Mann-Rempel.
I don't really have anything to add other than, it's been very informative, and I'm, again, appreciative of having been invited today, so thank you.
Thank you. Sapers?
Well, thanks, and I'm going to try to say this very carefully. And that is, senators, thank you for doing this, and thank you for the opportunity. And we have an opportunity to engage with one another, and in many ways. And we're always anxious from my office to answer the call when we're asked. I think the rich nature of the comments from engaged members of the public that came today are really the value added to this event, and I'm struck with the courage of people to come and tell their stories, and this is also what fuels the work of my office. I mean, moms and the other groups that have made their representation today, I think that's really where the learning is, and helps set some markers for where we have to go next.
Catherine Latimer.
I too am very grateful that this event has occurred, and I think what it does is it encourages and supports the need to actually take action and move things along. We've, I think, identified a lot of the problems, and now we need to look at some of the solutions. And I think one of the earlier opportunities we might have is the federal government's announced interest in the criminal justice review and looking at all of the legislative changes that have taken place and other basic problems. There are massive problems in the correction system outside of the mental health problems, which are significant in of themselves, but the entire graduated release system is not working. The complaint system is not working. I mean, we've heard bits from members of the audience speaking about other things, and I think it would be very important to all of us, I think, if the senators and all of the other members who were here were actively engaged in this criminal justice review to see if we can't move things forward with this particular opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Chapelle.
Thank you. First and foremost, I think there's a tremendous amount of promise just through this beginning, and I'm really pleased to be part of it and grateful. Absolute lack of and dire need of transparency within CSC, I think, is an important thing that hopefully we can attain. Senator Runciman, that core absolute more, everything. And a final point. Can't recall who made it about judges being more involved. The GANS report, I don't know how many people are familiar with, but my God, this has been an issue that many judges have issues with, and that is the corrections. Typically, there is a lot of work done. There are recommendations put forth. There is treatment. There is judges' comments that should be really imperative Pro Board of Canada reviews, but corrections, for whatever reason, often just doesn't seem to. Somehow we have what was deemed as a horse and buggy system at this point, but unfortunately it's not getting there, and if we can improve that would be great. Thank you.
Dr. Chaimowitz.
So I think we're a caring society. We as Canadians have reached out around the world and taken care of people struggling in dire circumstances in other countries. We don't have to look far to find people struggling in dire circumstances around the corner. I think it's time for a pan-Canadian framework to deal with this important issue. I really appreciate this initiative, and I think let's bring together the federal and the provincial governments and actually do something so that we don't have to read Howard Sapers' reports in 10 more years and say this has not been done, or read the Ashley Smith recommendations and say this has not been done. I think we need to ensure the equitable rights of prisoners to access care, psychiatric care especially. I think this is something we can be proud of as Canadians. I think we should lead, and I would, I guess on behalf of the panelists and everyone here, like to thank you for putting this together. I think this is a tremendous initiative, and I think on all of us, we want to thank you for today. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Certainly, we've heard a wealth of information this morning, and I want to thank our guest speakers that have come in to share their experience, to share their expertise, to share their stories. I want to thank as well the public who have engaged in the discussion and for sharing your stories. Thank you so much for that. Merci beaucoup à vous tous d'avoir.
Thank you to all of you for your presence. This is an important subject.
And as senators, whose role in large part is to be legislators, the more information that we have based on your stories and your expertise, the better legislators we will be, and thank you for that. Merci beaucoup.
And let me also, this is our last before the fall session. I want to thank Mike and Alexi who've done all of the logistical work and organizing all of this. And with that, this meeting is adjourned.